All right, so my name is Brendon Livingstone. I'm joined today by Bill Ross, Herman, Van Krieken, and Peter Smeaton. We all work at Equinox IT, providing IT consulting, software development, and IT training services in New Zealand. And on the Blab today, we're going to be talking about exploring DevOps and bimodal IT in a New Zealand IT context. And the first question is, what does DevOps mean in a New Zealand context? And I'll hand it over to you, guys.
Right. Okay. I think actually, for smaller companies in New Zealand, DevOps is almost a natural way of operating. Because they haven't got any choice. They haven't got separated development and operations teams. Small startups, small companies, they sort of just operate in that way, and probably have for a long time, but maybe didn't even have the name. It didn't associate the name DevOps with it. I don't know what you guys think of that situation.
Well, actually, I disagree. There are plenty of large organizations that do have very separate organizational structures that do operate in a more traditional way, and it would be very good for them to move into this DevOps principle to remove all the waste that goes on between development operations and all the unwritten expectations that happen when they throw things over the fence to all of a sudden become productionized.
Yeah, I think my comment was to do with small companies, but you're right. I agree. The larger ones adopt this traditional separation of development and operations, and where that comes from. Originally, I don't know. You think of like textbooks I did when I was doing my degree. Textbooks, IT textbooks on IT management. They said, "Oh, this is the way you structure an IT department. You have, these separate areas called development and operations." And everyone said, "Oh, yes, okay, that's the way it's done. That's always the way it's been done. So be it." And it's interesting. It's really being challenged, now. What's driving that challenge to that sort of traditional structure?
Yeah, and it's all underpinned by a whole bunch of technology development that makes it all possible to all of a sudden sit side by side and do seamless handovers and do continuous development and create a pipeline of delivery. That's all the outcomes that organizations will get from that. And as a result, quality goes up. As a result, the reduction of frustration in end users is greatly reduced.
Yeah, but only if it's done well.
Sure.
And I'm not sure actually it's not necessarily the technology that's driving it. It's probably that separation I think used to exist because of complexity. It couldn't be trusted that you could easily deploy something without a lot of configuration and the complexity of configuring and deployment and data migration and setup and all that stuff that goes on. I agree that some of the automation technologies have made that easier, but setting up that automation in your organization is considerable effort, and it's not sort of something you can just move to. It's sort of something I think you migrate to as you move that that deployment pipeline. You sort of move it closer and closer to the actual live system, and add the automation over time. It's quite a journey, I think, for any organisation that's going from the traditional structure to move to a real, true DevOps operation.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's not a trivial thing to do, but it's got to be driven by the need to reduce waste in the organization, and it has to be supported fully by the management team, the executive, to be able to get there, because it also requires investment, and the investment will take time to return the value back to the organization. But once it's done, it becomes a very valuable tool to fend off any competitive activities if they are sort of in that sort of game. And although government is obviously not, so the public sector is not in a competitive game, but they could gain significantly from doing something like this and investing in returning better quality services to the public at large.
I'd like to separate DevOps from speed of deployment. If I go back to my early experience in IT, then partly to do with the scale of the organisations that I worked for, but I think it was also just more common at the time. DevOps was a thing. It was what you did. You analysed a business area. You often wrote the code or had a high level of involvement in the code, and you saw it into production. And you were the one on the end of the cell phone when the batch failed at 11 o'clock or whatever. But that didn't correlate with a particularly fast change cycle. But nevertheless, there was no formal separation between build and run, if you like. And there were still advantages from that, because it meant that the people that were on the operations side had a deep knowledge of the software and so on. So I think there were advantages without the fast cycle times, which is something else, which was the continuous deployment and the agile aspect. That's relatively new, at least in my experience.
Yeah, that's a good point, Peter.
I think these are all separate things, and they can be considered separately, but then they can play together.
Yeah. So we have the question talks about the New Zealand context. Do you think there's a between what we're looking at here in New Zealand with DevOps and what other locations maybe?
Yeah, I think organisations that are, their business is technology. I guess the Googles and the Amazons of the world. They experiment essentially in real time through A/B tests and other approaches. It's intrinsic to what they do. Other organisations, techniques like that just aren't necessarily useful. And maybe Herman mentioned government departments. They're probably not in that situation of wanting to run experiments on their client base to see what they favour, although they potentially could. But it's more, I guess, delivering effective value to the to the stakeholders. And I think that the key thing is quick feedback cycles, and being able to deliver value quicker, but it's probably much more incremental as opposed to big bang deliveries of major releases. You're able to do more frequent but smaller value if deployed. And I guess there's certain bottlenecks that have always existed. Testing is a classic example. A regression test of a system. That in a big complex system that could be many weeks of work. And that's a transaction cost, if you like, especially if it's done manually. It's a transaction cost of putting out a new release. But some of these technologies allow you to reduce those transaction costs, automated testing, etc., to much smaller levels. And that's probably the key to it, is with reduction of the release transaction cost activities. So that we can be tested overnight automatically, and a lot of things come together from unit testing at the lowest level, integration testing, automated performance testing, and so on and so forth, that are the underpinnings of the ability to do this stuff.
Yeah, no, I totally agree, and as well, I've tried to mention, and probably didn't do so well in my first comment, is that the application of tools to underpin DevOps have made it possible to do some of the individual steps in the whole DevOps definition in a much more automated way, which make it more reliable, more repeatable, more automated, if you like, end to end. And as such, the speed of delivery gets greatly enhanced. It means the work packages or the changes can happen more frequently. That means the risk is reduced as a result also. So all that together, it makes this whole DevOps principle pretty much worthwhile to look into, I would suggest.
And I think an important aspect to it is the project approach to especially new software. When maybe it's not because a project that's releasing a new system, especially if it's a big bang release of a new system, they're not necessarily the way you judge projects through do they deliver on time and scope and budget, etc., often doesn't mean that the project gets an advantage by making the investment in that sort of automation, because once it sort of leaves the project, then it's in another world. The operations business as usual world, and that's often where the pain occurs. And my general sort of wisdom is that most money spent on any application is actually spent on it after it goes live. But there's so much emphasis on the project that maybe you're better thinking of almost dropping the project concept and thinking that the whole thing is a factory, and all the early iterations are the early part of business as usual. But you want to build assets, those sort of things we spoke about earlier, that are basically going to give you a payback over the complete life of the application.
I agree with that. I think the project approach historically needs to change to smaller increments. The minimal viable product concept that you see in the lean architecture world is probably a much better way to do it, and using DevOps to deploy that is a much better way of looking at the minimal parts and then following on then all the features or changes that you may want to make going forward. So DevOps on its own is probably not so wonderful, but if you take it into context with all the other lean principles, it becomes a very, very powerful tool to help the technology partners deliver value.
Just going back to what Bill said, I agree, Herman. But Bill, you talked about almost not wanting projects, or looked at the sort of destructive or the negative elements of projects around scope. So there's that whole thing that the project de-scopes, or does things to get over the line, and then it's over the line, and then it's ops problem. Yeah. But if you take up a more holistic view from an organizational total sort of lifetime cost, it's disadvantageous probably. And so, I mean, you either change that, you either sort of, move to a way which gets rid of projects and replaces them with some other construct, as per what Herman was saying, a more incremental approach, or maybe you change the scope of a project so that it fundamentally must be not just delivered as in posted through the slot, but actually in production, with a fully operational environment. You change that scope so that it's in the project's interests to deliver a complete thing.
Yeah, no, you couldn't agree more.